Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the first lecture on the digestive system for Anatomy and Physiology 2 at Madison Area Technical College. This first lecture will describe the general organization of the digestive system as well as provide a functional overview of what it does for our bodies. The organs of the digestive tract are likely familiar to you. From superior to inferior, they include the oral cavity, which of course includes the tongue and the teeth. Also the salivary glands, which are exocrine glands, secreting saliva into the oral cavity. The pharynx, which is a muscular tube, which inferiorly becomes the esophagus. And the rest of the digestive tract is also a muscular tube. Continuing onward, the pharynx empties into the stomach, and then the small intestine, and then the large intestine, finally ending in the rectum and the anus, the anal canal and then the anus. There are also some accessory organs, which we're going to talk about next, which aren't part of this muscular tube. So there's two categories of organs that belong to the digestive system. One category includes the organs that comprise what is known as the alimentary canal. This is a muscular tube including the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The term alimentary refers to nutrition or food that provides sustenance for us. The components of the alimentary canal are continuous from superior to inferior, and the openings at either end of the canal are controlled by sphincter muscles. At the oral opening is a muscle called the orbicularis oris, and at the inferior most end, the end of the large intestine, there's a sphincter muscle called the external anal sphincter. The other category of organs are the accessory organs, which are connected to the alimentary canal by ducts. These include the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. The teeth and the tongue would also be considered accessory organs since they aren't part of the muscular tube. Most of these provide secretions that aid in digestion, so they release many enzymes. And we'll talk about what digestion is next. So all the functions of the digestive system can be classified basically into three categories. The first category or set of functions involve ingesting nutrients, propelling those nutrients along the alimentary canal, so we could call that propulsion, and that involves different types of muscular motility, including swallowing, arrhythmic peristalsis, and arrhythmic segmentation. Within this category, I've also included elimination as a function of the digestive system, because after nutrients are absorbed, there are waste products or residue, and the digestive system removes these wastes from the body. The second category of function includes digestion and secretion of substances. So digestion is defined as breaking down nutrients into a usable form. Either breakdown occurs mechanically or chemically. Mechanical digestion involves chewing and muscular contraction of the digestive tract. Chemical digestion involves the secretion of digestive juices that break down nutrients into smaller components that can then be absorbed. But the digestive process is just the breakdown. Absorption is a different function. So the organs that perform this type of secretion include the salivary glands, which produce an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrate, the stomach, which which secretes enzymes that break down proteins, the liver, which makes bile, and the pancreas, which secretes many types of enzymes breaking down several different nutrient types. The last category of digestive function involves the acquisition of the nutrients, getting the nutrients from the lumen of the small intestine primarily across the wall of the alimentary canal and into the bloodstream. So transporting the usable nutrients in the smallest form that can be absorbed from the lumen through the epithelial lining, through the muscular lining, and ultimately into the bloodstream. The next thing that we're going to talk about involves more anatomy than physiology. So it's the position of the digestive organs within the abdominal pelvic cavity. As you probably already know, the stomach and the intestines contract, and they need freedom to move as they do so within the abdominal cavity. They're not tightly bound to the abdominal wall, but are loosely suspended from it by connective tissue called mesenteries. These mesenteries hold the abdominal viscera or organs in their proper relationships to each other, and in particular prevent the small intestine from becoming twisted and tangled by its own contractions or any changes in body position. The mesenteries also provide passageways for blood vessels and nerves that supply the digestive tract, as well as for lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels that can carry absorbed lipids from the small intestine into the bloodstream. So within mesenteries, you'll see embedded blood vessels and nerves, as well as lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels, which you'll witness in lab. So in actuality, the abdominal pelvic cavity, also called the peritoneal cavity, is a potential space full of organs. So this diagram that you're seeing here is a transverse section through the abdominal region, and it shows more of an embryonic development scheme than it does an adult anatomical form, but it shows the peritoneal cavity in gray. And recall that this cavity is lined with a membrane called the peritoneum. The peritoneum on the outer wall, which I'm tracing here, is referred to as the parietal peritoneum. Now the peritoneum turns inward or deep and becomes the visceral peritoneum that surrounds organs. The organs that lie within the cavity are suspended from the dorsal body wall by a mesentery. At least some of the organs are. This mesentery, which is shown kind of suspended from the dorsal body wall here, is called the dorsal mesentery. And it's actually the fusion of two peritoneal membranes. And when this dorsal mesentery reaches an organ, the two layers split or move around opposite sides of the organ to envelop the entire organ. In some locations, the visceral peritoneum wraps around first both sides of the first digestive organ. So, for example, we'll say the liver, okay, and then meet on the opposite side or the ventral side, forming a new double-layered mesentery. We would call this a ventral mesentery. Sometimes then it splits and wraps around another organ, for example the stomach, and meets again on the other side, forming another ventral mesentery. So the important concept with this is that the mesenteries that keep the organs in position are derived from the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. Some specific names of mesenteries that we're going to talk about are two ventral mesenteries, the lesser omentum and the greater omentum, which you will see when you perform dissection in the lab. The lesser omentum, a ventral mesentery, extends from the liver to the superior right margin of the stomach. The greater omentum is kind of like an apron hanging down from the inferior margin of the stomach. It covers the small intestine. This is a site for fat deposition as well. I'll give you a chance to look at both diagrams so that you can see the lesser omentum was actually formed from a mesentery coming from the liver, surrounding the stomach, and then the greater omentum comes from the stomach and moves inferiorly. At the most inferior point of the greater omentum, so down here, the greater omentum turns back on itself. So let's say it's come down inferiorly and then it turns around and starts moving superiorly. Where it reaches the transverse colon, so part of the large intestine, and anchors that large intestine to the dorsal body wall. So that's a dorsal mesentery called the mesocolon. It's kind of an interesting network. The small intestine mesentery is sometimes called the mesentery proper, is also a dorsal mesentery. So all of this is small intestine right here. This is the transverse colon right here. This is the stomach. Of course, the liver's on top. Superior, I should say. Okay, our next topic is histology of the digestive tract or the alimentary canal. And all digestive organs within the alimentary canal have the same four basic layers. From the lumen, which is the center, the opening of the digestive tract, we have first the mucosa, which is shown as kind of pink here. And then the layer that I guess is deep to it from the lumen is called the submucosa, and it's kind of gray with a lot of blood vessels in there. And then the third layer is the Muscularis Externa. And the most superficial layer, I guess I should really say, the most superficial layer is equivalent to the visceral peritoneum, but when you're talking about the organ itself, we call it either a serosa or an adventitia, and it depends on which organ you're in, which one it is, because the tissue varies slightly. So now we're going to look at each one of these layers and talk about what tissue is present in those layers. So the mucosa, our deepest layer, or the layer that lines the lumen, is composed of epithelial tissue. It varies from stratified squamous in the oral cavity in the esophagus to simple columnar in the stomach and the small intestine. A layer of loose connective tissue also exists in this area. So we already had epithelium, and then now we're talking about the loose connective tissue, which is really called the lamina propria. And you'll see that there are some glands associated with the lamina propria, as well as some lymphatic tissues. In the stomach and the small intestine, you'll see these glands forming gastric pits and intestinal crypts that go into the lamina propria. There's also a thin layer of smooth muscle tissue found in the mucosa, or innermost layer. It's called the Muscularis mucosa. So there's a little bit of contraction that can happen close to the lumen right there. Okay, the next layer outward is the submucosa, and the submucosa consists largely of loose connective tissue, and this provides a matrix through which a very rich supply of arterial and venous blood vessels run. There's also lymphatic vessels in there, shown as green. So this is where a lot of exchange of materials occurs in this between the blood and the tissue of the gut in this submucosal region. Also located within the submucosa is a network of nerves called a plexus, and this is showing you a nerve in what is known as the submucosal nerve plexus. This is part of what is known as the enteric nervous system. So the submucosal nerve plexus is one of two plexuses that make up the enteric nervous system. Enteric means gut or alimentary. And this enteric nervous system functions semi-autonomously without input from the central nervous system, or the peripheral for that matter. And it regulates both digestive motility or contraction, as well as digestive secretions. Okay, our third layer is the Muscularis Externa, and as its name implies, it's composed of smooth muscle. And there's two layers, a longitudinal layer and a circular layer. In the stomach, we'll see there's an extra layer, but generally there's at least two layers, longitudinal and circular, so that contraction can happen in two different directions. There's also a nerve plexus called the Mesenteric plexus located within the Muscularis Externa, and in yellow are shown nerves of the Mesenteric plexus, which will control contraction of those longitudinal and circular smooth muscles. The outermost layer, as mentioned, is called the serosa. It's equivalent to the visceral peritoneum, and it has two layers. The outermost layer is epithelium, and then between that epithelium and Muscularis Externa is loose connective tissue. In some locations, the serosa is thickened with extra connective tissue. And when that occurs, we call it adventitia, but you'll never have to worry about when is it a serosa and when is it an adventitia. We won't go into that detail. We'll just call it serosa. So in summary, the histology of the gastrointestinal tract, or the alimentary canal, includes 4 layers. Most superficially, number 4 here, is the serosa. That has connective tissue as well as epithelial tissue. Then deeper is the Muscularis Externa. That has smooth muscle and a Mesenteric plexus, nervous tissue. Then we go to the submucosa, a little bit deeper. And here we have lots of tissue types. We have loose connective tissue. We have some nervous tissue, which forms the submucosal plexus. And then we have all the tissues that make up vessels, blood vessels as well as lymphatic vessels. So there'll be some lymph, there'll be some blood, as well as the epithelial cells that line those vessels. Most deep here is the mucosa layer, and that contains epithelial tissue, a lamina propria, which is basically connective tissue, and then a very thin layer of muscle. I mean, it's just a stripe of pink here, which is called the Muscularis mucosa, as opposed to the Muscularis Externa, which is a layer in and of itself. Okay, the last part of this introductory information on the digestive system involves how digestive functions are controlled or regulated. So let's first think about the things that the digestive system can do. It can absorb, but those are just membrane transport mechanisms across an epithelial lining. Not really controlled by much other than the presence or absence of chemicals. But the digestive effectors that we're most interested in here in terms of digestive function include glands, mainly composed of epithelial tissue that can secrete something. So secretion is a digestive function. Then smooth muscle is present in the digestive tract, and it's important for moving along the food bolus and the chyme that we develop and moving the waste products along to the large intestine. We refer to this as motility. Sometimes it's just mixing of the contents of, like, the stomach to perform mechanical digestion, kind of pummel what you've eaten to break it up. So many stimuli can enhance either secretion or motility. In some cases it will be mechanical stretch, which causes increased secretion or motility, like when the stomach receives food, the stomach is stretched, it contracts in response. In other cases, it's the presence of certain chemical compounds that will either increase secretion or motility. For example, the presence of lipids in the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum, causes secretion of certain hormones and enzymes. Another case that would involve stimulation of a digestive function would be a nerve stimulating function. So neural stimulation would happen by both of the plexuses, the one that is in the submucosa and the one that's in the Muscularis Externa. The autonomic nervous system can also impact the activation done by the enteric nervous system. So we refer to these neural stimulations of digestive function as either a local short reflex or a long reflex. The difference is whether or not the central nervous system will be involved. So a local reflex we'll talk about, but a local reflex would be something is sensed in the digestive tract and the digestive tract responds on its own. A long reflex, which I'll talk about again, is first, of course, sensory input is received by the digestive tract, ultimately sent to the central nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system responds. Now, I've also included a fourth type of stimulation, which is actually pretty important, and we'll encounter it when we talk about the stomach and the small intestine in more detail. And that is the category of hormones signaling either through the bloodstream or some chemicals performing paracrine signaling. So I'm putting this in the category of chemical. because hormones, of course, are chemical compounds. And an example of how hormones can regulate digestive function would be that the epithelial cells in the stomach and small intestine, some of the epithelial cells can secrete hormones in response to certain nutrients. Those hormones not only act locally, but they will enter the bloodstream and stimulate target cells in different organs that are distant. And those organs will either secrete something or contract, because those are the main two functions of the digestive system that can be regulated, either secreting something or contracting motility. So this is a picture of the enteric nervous system. It's kind of weird because the wall of the alimentary canal is kind of blue and green, but it's partly because blue is overlapped with yellow that shows up as green. And so the yellow is the enteric nervous system nerves. And it's made up of two components: the mesenteric plexus, which we saw is externa, and the submucosal plexus, which is located deep in the submucosa. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, in the submucosa. Of course it is. I hope I made you smile. So the mesenteric plexus, as you know, will cause contraction of the smooth muscle in that same location. The mesenteric plexus refers to muscle, and so the muscularis externa will contract. This is important in peristalsis throughout the esophagus, the stomach, and then we call it segmentation once we get into the small intestine, and then we call it mass movement when we get into the large intestine. The submucosa, the plexus in the submucosa, really affects more what happens in the mucosa, so the pink layer. And that is, the submucosa plexus can cause secretion of materials from glands that are in the submucosa and in the mucosa into the lumen usually, and also motility of that thin layer of muscle close to the lumen. So now let's talk about how long-term or long-range reflexes, I think that's a better term than long-term reflexes, long-range reflexes, involve integrating central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system with those plexuses. So let's just review what we know about the autonomic nervous system. There's two branches: the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. You probably know the parasympathetic as rest and digest, and the sympathetic is, fight or flee, right? So, as one would expect, the parasympathetic nervous system enhances all digestive secretions, also enhances motility or contraction of the muscle in the wall of the alimentary canal. This is particularly important in the stomach and the intestines, small and large intestine. There's also some sphincters that are going to be controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, in contrast, will inhibit gastric secretions and decrease motility. And this is usually only active after a meal has passed through the beginning of the small intestine, called the duodenum, or it can happen during stress. This is a picture that's present in your textbook, short and long neural reflexes that control digestive system function. So first I'm going to do short range neural reflexes. So this is the lumen of the intestinal tract. There's either stretch here or the presence of some chemical which would be detected by a receptor that's embedded in most likely the submucosa. So a chemoreceptor would detect things like pH, the presence of lipids, the presence of proteins, osmolarity of the fluid inside the tract. A mechanoreceptor would respond to or be stimulated by stretch. If either one of those happens, the receptor detects the information and sends a signal via a sensory neuron to the enteric nervous system, which synapses on a local motor neuron, part of the enteric nervous system, that will go to either smooth muscle, causing constriction, or glands causing secretion. So that's a short reflex. Something inside the GI tract causes action within the GI tract. But often there are long neural reflexes as well. For example, when you smell cookies baking in the oven, or I see this wonderful pizza waiting for me. Of course I can smell that too. Or the thought of food, right? So those are external stimuli detected by the brain. And the brain can send information via the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic or sympathetic, to the enteric nervous system, or might synapse directly on the smooth muscle and glands in the wall of the alimentary canal. So that's considered a long reflex. Now the presence of certain materials in the lumen, or stretch, or the lack of stretch in the case of hunger pangs, will also be sent to higher brain centers that can affect output. But often this short reflex will be quicker. Well, it is quicker. So we'll see later throughout our study of the digestive system that parts of the digestive system are adapted for specific functions. Mechanical digestion, for example, occurs largely in the oral cavity and the stomach. Chemical digestion occurs largely in the small intestine, as does absorption. Food storage can happen in certain locations like the stomach, and passage of material happens throughout. So the next slide provides you with a summary of what we're about to explore in terms of digestive system physiology by the location of an organ. So note that chemical digestion occurs almost completely, not 100%, but almost completely in the small intestine, which is this region. There is some chemical digestion also in the stomach, proteins in particular. Also note that absorption happens primarily in the small intestine, and here are arrows showing you that whatever is in the small intestine is being absorbed into the bloodstream or maybe into a lymphatic vessel. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Thank you very much.